Singing in the dead of night. Take these broken wings and learn to fly. All your life, you were only waiting for this moment to arise.
Hello, students, and welcome to the first lecture for our second unit during the COVID spring over segregation during the civil rights movement, specifically segregation in the educational system in the United States. I'm going to cut this lecture into two different pieces, and those two different pieces are going to be shown over the course of 2 days. And today is going to focus specifically on kind of a recap of information that has happened, historical information from the end of the Civil War to where we are currently in the 1950s to kind of recap, because some of it was middle school content and it's been a while since middle school. And so I'm going to recap that today and then introduce Brown versus Board of Education, a Supreme Court case, with one of the 5 cases in the class action lawsuit being centered, and the namesake being centered in Topeka, Kansas. And so that'll be today's focal point. Tomorrow's focal point will be the challenge that comes to exist in terms of school segregation between state entities or powers and federal entities or powers. So it's kind of that age-old contrast that we've seen since the origin of our country with the Federalists and Anti-Federalists. And so that'll be the focus of our lesson tomorrow, specifically honing in on an event that happens in Little Rock, Arkansas, at Central High School in that city. And so we will focus upon that in our next lesson. So the two lectures that I'm going to cover the next 2 days focus upon segregation, or the splitting of the races in terms of education in the United States, and how integration, bringing the races together in one educational setting, becomes the legal precedent as of 1954. And so I'm going to start by just going over some information historically to kind of set us up for where we're going. All right. So I'm going to take us back specifically to 1863. In 1863 is when Abraham Lincoln passed the Emancipation Proclamation. And if you recall anything about the Emancipation Proclamation, this was during the American Civil War. And this is where Abraham Lincoln basically set free any slave in rebelling territory, so that would have been the Confederacy, as of January 1st, 1864. After that, you see the Civil War end in 1865. And the period of history following the end of the Civil War is known as Reconstruction. Reconstructing how our union will exist without the institution of slavery. And what you see here throughout this period are some radical changes. One thing that is going to come out of that in 1875 is we are going to have what is known as the Civil Rights Act of 1875. And basically, the Civil Rights Act of 1875 sets aside and outlaws segregation by race. However, as we see politics change during Reconstruction, the Civil Rights Act is passed in 1875. But in 1883, an all-white Supreme Court reverses that and actually declares the Civil Rights Act of 1875 unconstitutional, basically eliminating it and ultimately paving the way for the Jim Crow laws that we are going to see in the future and that are going to last from the 1880s all the way up until the time period we're talking about now, which is the 1950s, specifically throughout the southern states and the deep south, but in various locations around the United States. 1896 is the last date that I want to bring up before the current period that we're talking about. And that is the date that a Supreme Court case is ruled upon and heard and ruled upon. And that court case is known as Plessy v. Ferguson. Plessy v. Ferguson had to do with segregation on railroad cars, with blacks only cars, whites only cars. I won't go into great detail on the case because you will cover it again your senior year in government class, and I bet you covered it your freshman year in civics. Ultimately, though, what you need to know about Plessy v. Ferguson is that this case made segregation the law of the land because the ruling in Plessy v. Ferguson was that separate is okay, separate cars for the races, in this case for the railroad car, as long as it is equal. And so this becomes the precedent set with this court case in 1896. Segregation is the law of the land. We can have separate entities, whether it be a railroad car, whether it be later in history buses, whether it be institutions like schools, whether it be institutions like waiting rooms, etc. It becomes law of the land as long as those entities are equal. And so all of this kind of sets the stage for where we're going in the 1950s. In the early 1900s, though, we need to understand that organizations such as the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, makes it their goal to fight segregation. Now, there are two forms of segregation that I want to talk about. And these are excellent, and I believe they are vocab terms in your notes. So, excellent terms to take notes on. The two forms of segregation that I want to talk about are de jure segregation and de facto segregation. And I have kind of a mnemonic device to remember those. When you look at the term de jure, it's not spelled the same way, but it reminds me of a jury. De jure segregation is segregation by law. So those Jim Crow laws saying you must have a bathroom for blacks only and a bathroom for whites only. That would be an example of de jure segregation. The other form of segregation is de facto segregation. And de facto segregation means segregation by behavior. So someone not speaking to someone who is of a contrasting race, etc. And if you think about those two forms of segregation, de jure and de facto, which is going to be easier to target and stop? Well, the NAACP believes that they can use the courts to target de jure segregation and to put an end to it. And from the early 1900s, from 1909 onward, they are going to do just that, really revving up court cases in the late 1930s. So that's kind of your historical background from things that have not been covered recently related to setting context for this lecture. There are a couple of things that happen recently within our last unit, or our last couple of units, that also start the civil rights movement in the 1950s or act as the catalyst for the civil rights movement. And those are, just quickly to recap, Really, World War II served as an incredible catalyst. Some of the things that come out of that are one, you had a shortage of white male workers, and that's opened up a lot of job opportunities for African Americans. Two, you had 700,000 African Americans who served in the armed forces. If you remember the term from our World War II unit, double V or double victory, where African Americans were not only fighting to promote democracy and fighting for their nation, but they were also fighting back on the home front to bring those same ideas, those same freedoms to their own race in the United States. Also, FDR during the war is going to outlaw racial discrimination in federal agencies and in war related agencies. And then, last but not least, in 1948, so more recent, President Truman is going to formally desegregate the military through an executive order. And so, all of these things have served as a catalyst. Um, I said catalyst, and my cat got excited. Um, all of these things are going to serve as a catalyst for the civil rights movement happening in the 1950s. So, I want to talk about some of those challenges to segregation that occur at this point in time. And I want to give you a little bit of background for Kansas before we jump into this class action lawsuit that includes a school system in Kansas. So, first of all, as early as 1879 in the state of Kansas, segregation could happen in schools in our state. There was a little bit of a stipulation, though. Segregation happened at primary schools in cities with a population of more than 15,000 people. And let me be clear here. It didn't have to happen. It could happen. It was up to the school district in cities larger than 15,000 people as of 1879. Um, and so cities like Topeka, Kansas had segregated primary schools, elementary schools, middle schools. And throughout this time period from 1879 to 1954, throughout the state, secondary schools, such as high schools, were not segregated, with the exception of Wyandotte County, our neighboring county to the southeast. Um, it was it did have segregated secondary schools, but mostly what we're talking about here are going to be your elementary schools, and that's what comes up in the case of Brown v. Board of Education. Now, Brown v. Board of Education gets its name because of one of 5 cases involved in this class action lawsuit. And if you look at the map over here, on the side, there's Topeka, Kansas, one of the 5 cases. You have other cases in Delaware, in Washington, D.C., in Virginia, and in South Carolina. All of these are families who have filed complaints because their children are not allowed to go to certain schools. And we're going to focus in on the Kansas case here, Brown v. Board of Education. And the reason why this collective case with all 5 involved is called Brown v. Board is because Brown was the first letter of the alphabet, B for Brown, in the names of the different cases. And so Brown v. Board of Education is collectively 5 different cases. But Brown is Linda Brown and her father. And Linda Brown was a kindergarten student in Topeka, Kansas. And the Brown family lived about a block away from an elementary school. But that elementary school was white students only, and the Brown family were African Americans. Linda Brown instead had to travel more than 7 blocks as a kindergartner, over railroad crossings, through different main intersections in the city to get to the school that was deemed her elementary school that served the African American population in that region of Topeka, Kansas. Linda Brown's family did not think this was fair. They thought it put their child at risk, and they wanted her to be able to attend the school that was a block from her house, much like the families of the other claimants in the other cases. And so what ends up happening is this case will go to the Supreme Court, much as other cases at higher education institutions had done throughout the early 1950s. There's 2 cases noted here on the screen that were for institutions at the college level where it was argued that if you're going to have a law school for whites, you should have either the availability for African Americans to go to that law school, or they need their own law school at that institution, which is what was found in McLaurin v. Oklahoma State. But when we get to Linda Brown's case, this class action suit is going to actually repeal what was said in Plessy v. Ferguson that we just talked about a few minutes ago. Plessy v. Ferguson had said, segregation is okay as long as things are equal. But what the NAACP and what those involved in this case meant to prove is that segregation is not ever equal. And in fact, in public schools, it can cause inherent harm to children. And one of the ways that they've used to prove this, and I do have this scanned in as a supplemental activity, is if you look at the picture at the bottom of the screen here, I have a picture of 2 dolls. Those dolls denote what is known as the doll studies that was conducted by the Clarks, that is Dr. Kenneth B. and Mamie P. Clark, a married couple who were social scientists and psychologists. And they conducted a study that used dolls like this and questions to children about these dolls to show that racism and segregation caused psychological harm to children. Therefore, this was used in Brown v. Board of Education to show that segregation is not equal and it does inherent harm. The doll case or the doll studies are going to be critical in the court's ruling. And I'm just going to briefly read from the court's official ruling, and I have this scanned as a supplemental activity as well. But just to read from the official ruling of the Supreme Court on Brown v. Board of Education from 1954, we come then to the question presented: does segregation of children in public schools solely on the basis of race, even though the physical facilities and other tangible factors may be equal, deprive the children of the minority group of equal educational opportunities? We believe it does. Segregation of white and colored children in public schools has a detrimental effect upon the colored children. The impact is greater when it has the sanction of law. For the policy of segregating the races is usually interpreted as denoting the inferiority of the Negro group. A sense of inferiority affects the motivation of a child to learn. Segregation with the sanction of law, therefore, has a tendency to retard the educational and mental development of Negro children and to deprive them of some of the benefits they would receive in a racially integrated school system. Therefore, they concluded that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal had no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. And so, what this means is that segregation has been struck down by the highest court in the law. And so ultimately, that is going to mean that schools across the United States are going to need to integrate or bring the races together in one building. And if you look at the lower map down here, you can see that the red location is where schools were required to segregate. Yellow, no legislation. Blue, optional or limited. And we talked about for Kansas that was cities with over 15,000 population could segregate. Um, and then it was forbidden in the green locations. But what this means with the ruling of Brown versus Board in 1954 is all of those states are going to go to the green category. Now, many of those states that are in red are going to object to that. And that's why I have that last term on there, the Southern Manifesto. That is going to be a reaction to this ruling and to legal challenges to segregation. Basically, the southern states challenging federal authorities, which is what we'll get into tomorrow. I do have a link, a copy to the Southern Manifesto that is on the supplemental activities for today. And I do have a link on there as well for the doll studies so that you can read more in depth on the actual case study, or you can watch a quick video that gives you an overview of a reenactment and discussion of what the doll studies did. But that's what I have for today. I encourage you to make sure that your notes are filled out for the vocabulary we covered. If you have any questions, go ahead and come into Mr. Basler or myself's office hours, and we will be willing and able to help you. Have a great day. Be safe. Stay healthy.